Well, thank you all for viewing our webinar featuring the Vocational Rehabilitation Return on Investment Project. I'm Ann Outlaw from the Knowledge Translation for Employment Research Center, housed at the American Institute for Research, and funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, or NIDLR. The KTER Center works with an employment research outreach team to identify the focus of our webinars. Recently, this team requested information about fellow NIDLR projects who are making an impact with real-life outcomes. We found the VR Return on Investment project was highlighted in NIDLR's report to Congress. This research project developed a rigorous model to determine the employment impacts and return on investment for the VR program. Today, we'll hear from the team about the importance of gaining commitment from researchers and VR agency staff to create an economic model reflective of the VR program, how they provide multiple avenues for stakeholder engagement with feedback opportunities, and their focus on knowledge translation from the beginning of the project to increase their impact and sustainability. So now I'll pass it on to Rick Sizemore, who will moderate today's webcast. Rick?
Thank you so much. Welcome to today's webinar on the Vocational Rehabilitation Return on Investment Project. I'm Rick Sizemore. Currently, I'm the director of the Wilson Workforce and Rehabilitation Center in Fishersville, Virginia, and I can say that our program has certainly benefited from the VR ROI project, turning data into what we refer to as actionable information. Let me take just a moment, if I could, to look at the objectives for today's webinar. We're certainly going to provide an overview of the Vocational Rehabilitation Return on Investment, or as we refer to it, the VR ROI project. We'll also describe the project's approach to ongoing engagement of the state VR agencies and other stakeholders, and we'll provide examples of successful knowledge translation activities resulting from this ongoing stakeholder engagement. So that's what we have in the plans for today. I'd like to get started. We have an all-star panel of top experts on standby to go over this compelling information, including Dr. Bob Schmidt, who is the principal investigator of the VR ROI project from the University of Richmond. Welcome, Bob. Also,
Hi,
Dr.
Rick, happy to be here.
I thought we might have lost you there for a minute. Good to have you with us today, Bob. Dr. Joe Ashley is the co-principal investigator, also from the Virginia Department for Aging and Rehabilitation Services, where we also are hearing from Dr. Kirsten Rowe, who's the project coordinator today. Welcome, Joe and Kirsten.
Thanks, Rick.
Thanks, Rick. Glad to be here.
Good to have you both with us. And from George Washington University, Dr. Maureen McGuire-Couletz, who is a project liaison. Welcome, Dr. Couletz.
Thank you. So glad to be with you all today.
Awesome. Well, today we'll be discussing the approach used by VR ROI project to develop this usable information we've been talking about. And here is what we hope to accomplish on today's webinar. First, we'll give you a brief overview of the VR ROI project, then describe the project's approach to engaging state agencies and stakeholders, and then describe some examples of the project's knowledge translation activities. Once again, those all-important objectives. First up, we'll begin with Dr. Bob Schmidt. Bob, our first question is that there have been lots of other key professionals involved in this project, in addition to those that we'll hear from on the webinar. Could you give us a sense of who all has been involved in this exciting project?
Thanks, Rich. I'd be happy to. First of all, I should say before I talk about everyone, that this is a fairly complicated project, and we have separated our team into really two components. But before I talk about those, I should pay respect to a fellow who worked with us and has really been the inspiration for this work for a long time, and that's the late David Dean. David was active in the economics of disability for, I think, close to 40 years, starting with graduate school when he was a graduate assistant to Monroe Berkowitz at Rutgers University, and we owe a debt of gratitude to him. He died too young. All right. So we have really two major components of people who are active in it. The first we call the project management team, and we meet just about weekly to make sure that things move along smoothly. Now, every member, every speaker today that Rick introduced is part of the project management team. The person who was not able to meet with us today is Dr. Rob Froelich. He serves as a project manager, and he's an adjunct professor at the George Washington University, excuse me. Secondly, we have a research team. Now, everyone on this team is a PhD economist, and they serve as consultants. I'm part of that team as well. The first member of that alphabetically is Chris Clapp. He's a senior research associate in the Department of Economics at the University of Chicago. The second member is John Pepper, who's a Merrill Bankard Professor of Economics and Department Chair at the University of Virginia. And the third member is Stephen Stern, who's Professor of Economics at Stony Brook University. I believe that you also asked me to talk about the overarching theme of what we're talking about today. And that is, I think we've hinted at that already, but basically the overarching theme of what we've been doing in this project is nurturing an ongoing engagement and collaboration among, first of all, the economists. Secondly, staff at our partner VR agencies. We'll talk about those agencies in a minute. And third, the broader VR community. And what we're trying to engage and collaborate with everyone is in developing and implementing and refining the project's approach to VR ROI. So we're very interested in rigor, very interested in interpretability, and very interested in making it useful to all the entire VR community. So with that, I think I'll turn it back to Rick.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And as we focus on all of this, we'd like to get a sense from you the project's overview, and maybe you could get into some of that.
Okay, and I'd be happy to. So what we're looking at here, and I think we need the next slide. There we go. All right. This is actually the second grant we received from NIDLR, and Ann spelled out exactly what that stands for. The second grant we received from NIDLR. This research grant is designed to build on that grant. The first one was sort of kind of, I think, developing an econometric model, and it was sort of a proof of concept. Now that that worked out fairly well, we're trying to expand our focus to a more diverse set of VR agencies and more recent cohorts. So the agencies, we're partnering with agencies from 7 states, and there are 9 agencies. Now, on the screen, they're listed alphabetically. Now, I want to look at them a little bit differently. The first state mentioned is Delaware, and with them, we're working with their general agency. They have a blind agency as well, but we're working with the general agency. Additionally, we're working with 2 agencies from each of North Carolina and Virginia. So they have a separate general agency and a separate blind agency, and we're working with both of those. And then the other 4, Kentucky, Maryland, Oklahoma, and Texas, have combined agencies, so we're getting data for virtually all clients in those. Now, what we do is we collect cohorts of folks who applied in a particular fiscal year, state fiscal year. The ones we have been looking at are applicants in the year 2000, a separate cohort for 2007, and 2012. You'll get a sense that we look at individual disability, broad disability categories. And some of these disabilities have a relatively small sample. Now, our model requires a fairly large sample. So if we deal with a single agency, and that might be if we're looking at folks in the autism spectrum disorder, and or blind, or separately, blind and visual impairments, those are relatively low incidence disabilities, and a single year of applicants is insufficient for us to estimate the model accurately. And as a result, we are collecting over 6 years, 2000 to 2004, where we have a separate group for that. Now, one of the hallmarks of what we do is we use readily available administrative data. So we do not ask agencies. We're trying to keep this relatively convenient for agencies to participate and hopefully benefit from what we're working with them on. And in doing that, we collect readily available administrative data. So we do not ask agencies to go out and collect surveys or collect any other data that they do not already have access to administratively. In particular, most of the data that we work with are already in their database because they're parts of reports to the federal government. They're part of their standard reporting apparatus. So those things are in there, and we focus on those. Additionally, we ask that they might go out to whoever the unemployment insurance agency is, and we realize that sometimes though that agency charges the VR agency for records. So part of our early planning when we set the proposal up for this project was to budget some money to help reimburse the agencies because we realize there's some programming costs, even though we hope to minimize those, and maybe reimburse UI agencies for that. So that's part of our budgeting process. Okay, I think we're ready for the next slide. Okay. Now, in doing this, I want to start and say that when we're looking at the impacts of service provision on the chance of getting a job or employment, as well as earnings for folks who are employed once you gain employment. For a long, long time, the focus on doing this type of research, impact research, outcomes research, was on what we call a generic client. So research looked at all individuals in the program in VR and just kind of looked at a generic service. So individuals who receive significant or substantive services, VR services, versus those who did not. What some people call a treatment group and a comparison group or control group, okay, of non-recipients. And so now what you're really talking about is sort of a generic service type. They receive some sort of significant or substantive services for a generic client who receives services. No demarcation by what type of disability they have or anything of that sort. And then the third part of that was that most of this research looked at the report to the federal agencies, the RSA 911 report to be precise, and what was collected for a long time was employment and earnings at closure. So essentially the week of closure. Now, what we decided is we'd like to attack all three of those a little differently. So in the first bullet point, you'll see that we generate estimates of the impact of specific types of VR services. So first of all, we don't look at a generic service. We do what we kind of crack the black box of VR services. We look at broadly, we try to aggregate service provided into 7 to 9 service types that seem to make sense to folks that we have worked with at VR agencies, talk with about that. So we find the impact of each of these, and then so that's one thing. The second thing is that rather than just looking at how they did at the time they exited the VR program, we'd like to look at a longer term on that. So that's why we go out to UI or unemployment insurance agencies to collect that sort of information. So we look at a period of 2 to 3 years before folks got into the program. We collect information for that. That provides a baseline prior to service receipt to see what the impact of service are. It's a baseline for that. And then we try to collect at least 5 years of earnings after application to VR. So that we think that's important because if you simply look at what happened upon exit or now with the more recent reporting requirements, a year after exit, you might miss part of the picture, might miss part of the impact. In particular, as an example, if you think about transitioning youth who, when upon exiting the program, who might actually be in the program during high school now, during part of their schooling, and after exited, they're just going on the labor force. They're looking for a new job. They're getting their feet on the ground. They're kind of working their way up. And that, the kind of service they receive be they training or higher education services or GED or those sorts of things, it might take a little while for those to show up, longer than certainly at exit, maybe even longer than a year. So we'd like to see what happens 2, 3, 4, 5, or more years out. Secondly, we estimate separately by disabling condition. Now, primarily what we looked at a lot are folks who have been diagnosed with mental illness or a cognitive impairment, including both learning disabilities and intellectual disabilities, physical disabilities, including both internal, musculoskeletal, and blindness or vision impairment. All right? And then from those, we can work up to an overall ROI agency. So when we do our estimates, what we do is we do separate estimates of service impacts by type of service for each disability from each agency. So we do a lot of estimation, and it gives us a pretty rich look at these things, what kind of commonalities there are across, as well as what kind of differences are across agencies. This is covered, there's more detail in our resource section on our website, which is www.brroi.org. Okay, next slide. And we emphasize ongoing engagement with our agencies and the broader VR community. And my colleagues will talk about this a little bit more. I just wanted to talk through this slide and tell you how we go about that. So when we first begin working with an agency, we do a little prep work, and then we make a trip of 3, 4, or 5 of us, well, some people on conference call. We actually make a trip to the agency. And the purpose of this trip is several-fold. One is to give folks there an idea of what we do and some past results to get an idea of what they might expect and how to interpret it and why this is informative from their standpoint. As important, we try to get more information about their particular agency, the institutional constraints, institutional structure, and one of the key things that we do in this project is we try to kind of capitalize one of the very important features of the VR program, and that is a partnership, real collaboration, cooperative agreement between a client and their counselor. That is, this is an individualized program, and those two folks work together in, first of all, laying out goals for their VR stint, and then secondly, how to achieve those goals, that is a service regimen. We take advantage of that in our modeling to sort of figure out who gets what kind of services and why. So that's an important part of what we do. That's the first thing we do. So we try to get an idea of how to group their particular service. They might have 300 or 400 categories of services down to our 7 to 9. That's the first thing. And then once we then start working with folks in data and actually collect the data sets, we then do some early kind of checking on it. So then we put together some sort of descriptive analysis, like, for example, what percentage of folks receive this type of service for this type of disability, kind of average ages and percent who are male and by race, and all those sorts of things that are collected. And then we try to have a conference call with folks there who know that. And what we're asking is, does this stuff pass the smell test? Does this look right? Or are we misunderstanding the data, or did we somehow deal with it wrong? So we kind of consistently have integrity checks built in to the thing. That's the second thing. Then we start kind of estimating things, estimating employment and earnings impacts as well as ROI. And we do it, first we get those sorts of things, then we probably make another trip to the agency to present those and really interrogate those results. Again, do these make sense? Does it look valid? What did we miss? What do we have wrong? And based on that, we then refine the model. That is, we, quote, customize it or incorporate more of the institutional aspects that maybe we hadn't seen in other agencies. So each one is kind of a customized thing. what we try to do then is we try to do a methodologically rigorous approach that is valid, understandable, and touches a little bit more about things. Now, what we've done is we have tested this out, our approach in the economic academic literature, and we have to date, I think, 5 articles published that are reviewed by well-regarded economic academic journals that are blind reviewed. So it's blind referee, double-blind referee process. So we think we kind of passed the validity, the rigor test. Okay, I think next slide is. I think I'm done.
You are indeed, and what a wonderful overview of VR ROI. We appreciate that so much. Dr. Bob Schmidt from the University of Richmond, and he comes to us from his office in Richmond, Virginia. Again, thank you, Bob. As we continue our conversation on the vocational rehabilitation return on investment, we welcome Dr. Kristen Rowe from the Virginia Department for Aging and Rehabilitative Services. Welcome, Kristen.
Hi, Rick.
So, Kirsten, I'd like to get your perspectives on the significance of the collaboration between the voc rehab professionals and the research economists that were involved in this project.
Well, as Bob has said, the VR agencies are active partners, and and the research team engages with them at multiple points in the process. But we've also been engaged. VR has also been engaged and involved as an equal partner from the very first grant applications. We were at Virginia DAR substantially involved in helping to develop the successful grant application that led to the first NIDLR grant, as well as to the current one. And Dr. Joe Ashley, who has recently retired from the Department for Aging and Rehab Services and is now a private consultant, is co-PI on the current project, and had that role while he was still working with our agency. It was really important. I think all of us recognized it was really important to have VR integrally involved in identifying the research questions and understanding the research design and making sure it made sense in a VR context, and was going to produce information that was relevant to VR. That level of involvement helped from the very beginning to make sure this was focused on the people who, on the needs of the people, that is the agencies and the people served by VR, so that it was going to be meaningful and relevant for them. The other thing that Bob mentioned that I think was really critical, and has been an important kind of reflection of the partnership and how VR has been engaged as an equal partner, has been in recognizing that participating in this kind of research project, while desirable and interesting and exciting, doesn't come without cost. And as Bob said, grant funds have been allocated made available to all the agencies to support some of their costs for participating, particularly around acquisition of data and providing of the information that the researchers need to do the analyses. We also helped in the development of the current disability and rehabilitation research project grant to identify who were some of the stakeholder groups that needed to be involved, how to engage with them, made sure that grant funds were allocated towards those kinds of stakeholder engagement activities. And then also in helping to think about, so what kinds of knowledge translation strategies were going to be useful for us, that is, for VR agencies and VR professionals, so that we've got the the economist audience, the academic economist audience, making sure that the research makes sense from an academic economist research perspective. But we've also got the VR people making sure that those rigorous results make sense and are useful for these stakeholder groups, including us. And I think that one of the things that has made this so unique in our experience is the fact that this project, by its very nature, is about understanding VR as it actually operates. It's understanding what VR business as usual is, rather than, as is the case with a number of other interesting research projects we've been involved in, rather than sort of laying something else on top of VR, like a new promising practice, and testing out its effectiveness in addition to VR. So this is all about VR and what impact it has for the people it serves, and that's why it's been so successful for us and so important for us to be an equal partner in it.
And that's, as you say, why it has been so interesting and desirable to participate in that. Kirsten, it sounds like there's been a lot of discussion with vocational rehabilitation professionals as this project has evolved. So did you have any aha moments in your discussions with the folks that you've talked to?
Oh, yeah, multiple ahas, including enhanced understanding of what economics is and the kinds of things that economists talk about all the time that used to be like foreign language to me. but really in terms of engaging our other VR stakeholders and getting VR professionals involved in the conversation. Early on in the project, we were at a meeting of the Council of State Administrators of Vocational Rehabilitation. They have national meetings, and we were explaining what the project was about and what we hoped to get out of it, and how the project was going to be implemented. And one of the participants in that meeting commented that what we were describing, the fact that it was going to look at the specific services specific people got, the fact that it was looking at the impact for each individual who got services in terms of their long-term employment and earnings. His comment was, wow, it sounds like this would be really valuable information to VR program participants to help them make informed choices about the kinds of services that might be appropriate for them. And honestly, we hadn't even thought about the project having that kind of use, but it was like, oh yeah, this is not only useful for us VR professionals in understanding what kinds of services are more effective for which populations and what the employment and earnings outcomes are for the people we serve, but yeah, we can use this more broadly to help the people we serve understand why it might make sense for them to get some assistive technology, how that might help them be better employed and earn more in the long run, or how participating in post-secondary education or training might ultimately lead to better long-term outcomes for them. That was one of the many ways in which ongoing consultation and stakeholder engagement has been really important for the project.
Leading to those aha moments. That Council of State Administrators for Vocational Rehabilitation, or as many of us say, CSAVR, the synergy that you find at those conferences really is a perfect backdrop to those aha moments. And Kirsten, I just love that phrase, learning to talk with economists, because I've certainly, over the course of this project, really enjoyed learning at a deeper level like many of us have. So thank you so much, Kirsten. Dr. Kirsten Rowe, Project Coordinator, Virginia Department for Aging and Rehabilitative Services in Richmond, Virginia, where we also will connect with Dr. Joe Ashley, who just concluded a celebrated career in Voc Rehab at Virginia DARS, and he now is a consultant and works on a variety of projects in the VR community. Welcome, Joe.
Well, thanks, Rick.
Joe, I have heard you mention creating stakeholder involvement. You have a phrase that I absolutely love, early and often. So how has this been part of the project, and what is the significance?
Well, thanks for the opportunity today, Rick, and to all the audience. I think the early and often is sort of a phrase that we've used from the beginning, from the Field Initiated project that Bob talked about, where we went out early on and talked with a variety of folks, including RSA and NIDER. We hadn't had the grant a month before we were up talking to leadership there about our project. And what we learned from that discussion is that we needed to be a little clearer on one of the points Bob made, the readily available administrative data, because a lot of people had ideas on things they'd like us to research, but everything they were suggesting would have required a lot of data gathering. And what we were trying to do is put together something about readily available data that can be used to turn into this long-term employment outcome research. So our concept from that is that we learned that we needed to be clear on our purposes and the things that our model could do. We also learned some things that people wanted us to be thinking about. So that became important as we began to look down the road at the model that we have currently created. But that's an example of some of the early opportunities we had. And Bob mentioned some that we do going directly out to agencies to talk to all of their staff. I would call it addressing their enlightened self-interest. Why is it important for them to be able to participate in our project? And I think that's listening to, or if you will, going out and actively listening to folks and providing them information so that we have a good, honest discussion about the project, what the expectations are, and the data needs that we have. We've also taken time to reach out and have a really robust advisory committee that we use. We put them to work a lot in this project. And they were all the agency heads of any agency involved was invited to be a part of it. They often would bring key staff who they thought needed to hear the information. We had a state rehabilitation council, and we had a group of community rehab program, some advisory committees. They had representation on the group. We had another economist involved from Mathematica. We had CSAVR representation. And we later added the National Council for Administrators of the Blind agencies involved. And with that robust group, we began to have, they would see the early data, they would give us feedback. It was honest discussions about, well, does this make sense? It's that smell test Bob talked about. And we would go back and forth with them on what we were seeing and what issues might be is there in the data that we're observing. This would often lead to follow-up questions with agency staff at the administrative level, such as supervisors and directors, who then we could follow up with, well, this is what we're observing. Why would this happen? How are these? How does one determine what client goes to which counselor? Those kinds of pieces of information to better develop the instrumental variables that were being used. So with all this kind of feedback early in the model development and ongoing in this process, it becomes important to us to be able to do that. The other thing that we did with this was have some focus groups that were sort of organized. We went to CSAVR again and invited individuals who were not necessarily agency heads in our agency, but agency heads and their key staff who were interested. We had representatives from the various state rehabilitation councils. Maureen was good enough to get us some involvement from the TASTE Center directors at that time, and a variety of other stakeholders who might be at a CSAVR meeting. And with that group, we had a professionally facilitated discussion after we presented the model and said, how would people use this model? What kinds of information would be needed for them to understand the model? That became important. How do you take this economics information and turn it into something that's more understandable and actionable? And those were very helpful to us to understand how we needed to be thinking about putting the information out for others to consume. We also went to the National Rehabilitation Association to get closer to people who are direct service providers and asked them similar kinds of questions in a similar format. And they had slightly different takes on the kind of information they would like to see. Again, we had to put that into the process where we were building a model that could be understood and the information be used. As you'll hear from Maureen and more about, another piece we built in was getting to some of these individuals that are a little closer to the action in the VR agencies through a learning collaborative. Getting to people who understand how to translate information to VR audiences was critical, we thought, to being able to make sure the information was actionable before it was over with. So I would say that is a variety of the types of outreach efforts we've done. They all involve us presenting information and getting feedback, taking the time to listen, and then take action on this information that's provided. I think those would be the main points, Rick.
You know, having worked with you for over 3 decades, you are the master of gathering large groups of people together, getting synergy and learning more about what the true needs are. And I can only imagine just how exciting those sessions were. But what were some of the takeaways that came from your stakeholder meetings and focus groups?
Rick, I would say that it's the listening tour type of option, you know, making sure that we were listening. And then I think active learning, making it became clear to these agency heads and other participants that our economists were working very hard to learn how VR works and better understand it so they could build a better model that represented them. We were asking these agency heads to trust us, if you think about it, because their outcome data was going to be put out there to the world. So we felt it was important to respect that commitment and spend time learning and listening with them and then taking action. And if we couldn't do something, they understand why before it's over with. And when you get into results, sometimes they're great, but if they're not and you've taken the time to do this, I think that's where the trust comes in and they understand that this is just where the data led us. And we've had some great discussions on what that means in certain agencies and things they might have done differently or they might be ready to do differently. So that's been a great part of this process.
That's wonderful. Well, if you'd like to learn more about Joe, you can hear a podcast interview at VR Workforce Studio, Blind Man with a Vision, which has certainly been something many people have enjoyed. You can find that at vrworkforcestudio.com and iTunes or on the Global Impact Today radio network. Thank you, Dr. Ashley.
Thank you, Rick. It was my pleasure.
Next up is Dr. Maureen McGuire-Couletz, who heads up the Rehabilitation Counseling Program at George Washington University. Welcome, Maureen.
Rick, I'm so pleased to be with everybody today. Thank you for including me.
Oh, absolutely. So, Maureen, what do you see as the critical points of knowledge translation?
Well, I think that, knowledge translation is more than simply the distribution of practical scientific information, relying on getting that information out with academic publications as the primary dissemination plan. This project from the very beginning through the wonderful vision of Dr. Joe Ashley engaged VR training experts as major project partners from the very beginning. As you heard, resources were allocated for stakeholder involvement throughout the process, including VR leadership, administrators, counselors, legislators, advocacy groups, and, as you've also heard, people who are consumers of vocational rehabilitation services. We have made extensive use and continue to make extensive use of our advisory committees and expert panels, and we use learning communities, people who are concerned and using this data to have used that throughout the project. Anyone listening to the podcast who thinks they'd like to learn more or become more involved in one of these learning communities, please go to our website, vrroi.org, and you can easily sign up for our newsletter and any new information coming out, training opportunities, and a number of other things like that. One of the things we realized right away was that we needed this feedback to better inform, to make sure that staff knew what was going on, and to do a better job of introducing return on investment concepts to folks with the expression I like to use, who are boots on the ground. They're out serving, they're in their communities. How can I take this information and how can I use it to better serve my customer or clients in the field? Then we also used these groups to help us look at how we could develop project-related training and provide technical assistance products, once again, for legislators, administrators, program developers, program evaluators, counselors, advocacy groups, and consumers.
Yeah, you mentioned the VR ROI newsletter. That is a fabulous resource. And for those on Twitter, you can certainly follow a lot of what happens up to date and in the minute at VR_ROI on Twitter. Maureen, can you tell us about a product that came out of these stakeholder discussions and why that's important to knowledge translation?
Oh, sure, Rick. You know, actually, there's a number of products. Once again, when you go to the website, in addition to the rigorous academic journal articles, there's training, handouts, and a number of other things. But I'd say that one of the big things that grew out of this was the development of the ethical use of data presentations and the return on investment 101 modules. It was very interesting at the very beginning. The National Council of State Rehab Council of Advisory Committees became very interested in the VR ROI project, but admitted that they weren't terribly familiar with even what return on investment was and what questions they need to be asking. And from their feedback, and these are consumers, we learned and realized that we needed to create some VR, as we call them, ROI 101 modules that they could reference and go back to and kind of help get themselves up to speed so they knew what they needed to be looking for as they worked closely with their state agencies. Also, we heard the same thing from counselors and from consumers. So we have found these modules, which are available on the website at no cost for CRC credits. Are available, so please come and check it out. We also, I mentioned before about the ethical use of data, that we saw that the ethical use of data is very important, not only by economists, but by the people who are taking the information so that good decision making is being made to help enhance the program. And we're not misrepresenting the information that we find. As Dr. Ashley and Dr. Schmidt pointed out, the data is the data. It's making sure that it passed that quote-unquote smell test and it makes sense, but some things work well, some things don't. The intent is not to eliminate, but rather to improve on services and find out how we can do many more good things to serve people with disabilities.
It's been so powerful to bring groups of people who have not traditionally worked together in the past, governmental staff and entities with economists, and to have these types of discussions. So thank you for all that you've done. Dr. Maureen McGuire-Kuletz is the Director of Rehabilitation Counseling at George Washington University and has been the project liaison on the Vocational Rehabilitation Return on Investment project. Thank you, Maureen.
Thank you, Rick.
Okay, so now it's time for some discussion about how we bring all of this together. And so we have some questions on the elevator speech. So open it up. Let's explore how we actually bring that into focus, into some short discussions that people can really grasp and carry forward. So, Joe?
I think Bob's going to start by reviewing the elevator speech for us.
All right. I'll be happy to. So the elevator speech is pretty concise. What it says, I'm just going to read it and then I'll talk about it a little bit more. So for those VR applicants in 2000, so that's the earliest cohort, received VR services, 80% enjoyed earnings gains that exceeded the cost of their VR vocational rehab services. For every $1,000 spent by the Virginia Department for Aging and Rehabilitative Services, the average, and by that we mean the median, half of the folks were below, half the folks were above, the median consumer earned $7,100 more over 10 years than they would have earned without VR services. And the top 10% earned $45,100 or even more over the same period. Now, there are three numbers in here, and I'd like to explain each briefly. The first of those is that 80% enjoyed earnings gains exceeding the cost of their VR. When we first presented material like this in a larger audience to some agency heads, what they were, the person was actually, he liked that figure. And what he liked about it, well, first of all, it's pretty strong. But what he liked about it is he said that if you had said that 100% of applicants, 100% of customers exceeded, their gains exceeded the cost, then I wouldn't believe it. I knew that you guys had rigged the data somehow. It's good to realize we all know that not everyone benefits from this. Now, having said that, we need to say one more thing, right? These are 80% enjoyed earnings gains that exceeded the cost of their VR. There are even more who had earnings gains, but they were not covered by the cost of VR. So that's the first number. The second number is that $7,100 number. I already said that's the median, so half above, half below. And basically what that says is it's a 7-to-1 ratio of earnings gains to dollars spent. So if $2,000, the median would get $14,200. And it's over a 10-year period. That's that point we make about how useful it is to have longer run income and employment data, earnings and employment data. The third figure, and that's really, 7-to-1 is quite strong. The third figure is the top 10%. So that's a 45-to-1 ratio. For every $1,000, their earnings increased by over $45,000, and that's incredibly strong. That's almost off the charts. So this points out one other thing we did, which is getting away from the succinct nature of this, which is that when we make these estimates, we actually make those earnings gains versus costs, we make them on an individual basis. So that in this case, this is rounded up from 3 different disability types: mental illness, cognitive impairments, physical impairment, and then we could round those up or scale those up to kind of cover the whole agency, because that covers over 80% of the individuals who applied to DARS. And doing that, we can then do an agency-wide, or we can do it by disability type. This is a simple nature of it. So it's pretty strong results.
That is just excellent. I was so excited about it, I jumped the gun and wanted to go to where this thing came from. Joe, maybe it's time now for you to talk a little bit about the elevator speech and how it came about.
Thanks, Rick. Well, what happened, it started with the advisory committee in particular, and we had some folks from the CSAVR that are on that committee, and particularly the chair of the committee, which happened to be my boss, really wanted something that was more concise, that was understandable to other people than economists, and would get people's attention. So the concept was having something that could be delivered relatively quickly, that met the standard of it's accurate to what the data shows, but was concise enough to be understood by others. And the intended audience for this was the agency heads, the people to whom they reported. So in our case, it was the Secretary of Health and Human Resources in Virginia. Other states have different folks. It was also used and wanted to share with members of Congress. As I noted in some of in the slide, when we started this conversation, we weren't sure how to do it, and then some of the first versions, it took a 23-story building to be able to have the elevator speech. It took a long time. But we began to narrow that down, so now it's, 2, maybe 3 floors, depending on how fast your elevator is. And again, it's designed to get somebody's attention. In the meeting that Bob referenced earlier, I had a 5-minute opportunity during a larger meeting with the Secretary of Health and Human Resources in Virginia, and went through this information with the Secretary. And what he requested is that the whole team come back, and we spent 2 hours with about 20 people that he wanted included from other agencies and legislative staffers, those kinds of folks, to hear what we had with this information. So that's the kind of action that we had hoped for it to be able to do, grab attention, and then lead into a longer conversation. So that's really, the pressure was from the agency heads to, we need something we can use that's very quick. So we weren't willing to do quick and dirty, and so we went back and forth a little bit to get to this concise talk, or this concise paragraph.
Yeah, very, very, very nice. I think we're ready for our next slide. As the director of Wilson Workforce and Rehabilitation Center, I know we have benefited from this ROI project because it's presented us information that helped us demonstrate the program's effectiveness, particularly in one of our programs, the PERT program that works with youth and helps them plan their careers. Can you describe the efforts to develop the informational statement and how this became a joint project, really, between the researchers and the PERT staff?
Rick, this is Kirsten. I'll be happy to take that question. So the researchers, as well as the PERT staff, the Post-Secondary Education Rehabilitation Transition Program staff at the Wilson Center, were interested in using the ROI model to look at that program. And because of the strength and flexibility of the model, it was possible to use it for a specific program. And it produced some really positive and encouraging results, which the staff of that program were thrilled to hear about, given that they work sort of at the front end of the rehabilitation process in conducting career and independent living skills assessments with high school students who aren't yet at the point of transitioning from school to work, but who are starting that process, and then who work with community-based teams that include school staff to implement those individual assessment findings with the students, and folks who are served by the program, as you know, of course, often get additional vocational rehabilitation services. And while the staff were excited, they weren't quite sure how to frame these results in a way that both made sense and was understandable by the people they work with, and still accurate in terms of maintaining the integrity of the results. So the Wilson Center's across the Blue Ridge Mountains from the Richmond area, so the members of the research team got in the car and drove over the mountain and sat down with the program staff to talk through, so what did these results mean, and how can we frame them in ways that are accurate, but also communicate what's important for us and for the people we serve. And so what they finally came up with is on the slide. The graphic that's on the slide comes directly out of PERT program materials, and it describes the impact of PERT on finding a job and later income. So anybody who participates in PERT has a 12% greater likelihood of finding and keeping a job. And if they go back to school for at least one more year of education, the chance of getting and keeping a job increases by another 38%. And after finding a job, on average, those who participate in PERT will have double the amount of earnings of similar people who don't participate in PERT. And that's really powerful information that's framed in a way that respects the limits on the data results and communicates it in a way that makes it make sense and helps provide ammunition, if you will, for staff to encourage kids to stay in school and to continue with their vocational rehabilitation so that they will indeed, in the long run, have much greater earnings than they might otherwise have.
Rick, this is Maureen. If I could pop in here, I just would say this is an excellent example of the ethical use of data. Researchers working with the staff to make sure information they're presenting is accurate, and then the staff making sure that parents and students understand the information and, more importantly, know how to use it to better inform their decision making.
Yeah, what an excellent point. And I know here at Wilson, as the staff became aware of this information, it was a tremendous boost to their morale. And I don't think really anyone anticipated that really a user of this information might be the actual staff who are talking with parents and students and offering information about, the effects of what they're getting into at the rehab center here. And that led to a brochure that is still in use today with that powerful information to inform, inspire, and sometimes motivate students toward an end goal. We're reaching the end of our webinar. Bob, do you have any closing comments?
Yes, I do. Thanks, Rick. First of all, I'm very happy to have been part of this webinar today. I think for me, it's been very useful, very interesting. But also, I'd like to express my gratitude for this whole project. It's been wonderful. The interactive nature between the economists, the VR agent staff, project, everybody on this thing, has been rewarding for all of us. The one thing you learn when you move out of your discipline, out of your area of expertise, you learn, first of all, that there's a lot to learn from a lot of people. Secondly, of course, and this isn't just specific to the economists, you find out that as economists or anyone in any particular area of expertise, they often mostly deal with other people with that same area of expertise. So you start talking in shorthand or what you generally call jargon, right? And then you lay that jargon out on other people and you find out that it's not quite so clear as you thought. And as you try to explain it better and better, you understand what's going on better and better. And maybe you find some things where you can improve your thought process on how to do that. And that's certainly been the case here. As I said, it's been iterative. We've learned a lot from agencies and our trips to the agencies, not just about the VR program, but also about approach to the economics of disability. So for me, it's been wonderful.
It has been a great experience. I'd like to thank our panelists, Bob Schmidt, Kirsten Rowe, Joe Ashley, and Maureen McGuire-Couletz for the webinar today. And I'd like to thank you for joining us. Contact information is available through the webinar for all of today's speakers in case you'd like to get in contact with them. I'd also like to invite you to join us for inspiring success stories of vocational rehabilitation clients, as well as reflections from the champions of business and industry that hire individuals with disabilities and vocational rehabilitation professionals who have dedicated their lives and careers to helping people with disabilities become employed. You can join me, Rick Sizemore, for another exciting episode of the VR Workforce Studio podcast at vrworkforcestudio.com. We have an inspiring and informative episode that posted on May 1st featuring Shane Paget, who became a long-distance truck driver through the E3 Targeted Communities Grant. So I hope you'll join us for Shane's story, VR at the Crossroads of Disability and Poverty. Again, I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Until next time, let's all be the spark that ignites vocational rehabilitation. We now turn things back over to Ann Outlaw.
Well, thank you very much, Rick, and thank you for the entire panel for preparing this presentation today. eye-opening to hear the thoughtful steps that your project takes to working together to produce those useful, actionable, and understandable products for the diverse set of stakeholders you have at the table. Before we close today, I'd like to invite all of our registrants to fill out a brief evaluation. It should just take about 2 or 3 minutes to fill this out. If you registered for the podcast or for the webcast today, I'll email it to you. If you have not yet registered, you can find it on our website at kter.org. And without further ado, I'd like to thank NIDLR for supporting our products at the KTER Center, including this webcast and various other activities. So thank you all and have a good day.